Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the July 22nd, 2026 Left Plan 2 Board meeting. I'd like to call it to order and start off with a moment of silence. All right, thank you very much. We have a very aggressive agenda today. Thank you. Shout out to our team for running a bunch of copies this morning, so thank you very much. Appreciate you. Item number 1 on our list is the approval of our June 30th, been moved and seconded. All in favor? Opposed? Minutes of our June meeting are adopted. Okay, now we're not going to adjourn yet, so make sure you hold that one in your pocket. I know. Yeah, see, there you go. I knew you guys. All right. Item number 2 on our list is the actuarial audit results from Milliman. Ryan, I believe, and Scott are both here. So, yeah, good to see you again.
I'll speak here to make sure you save plenty of time. Talk all the action.
Yeah.
Move to accept.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for having us here today. The purpose. Oh, thank you. I like to think I talk loud, but for the people at home. The OSA completed the 2025 actual evaluation and rate setting process, and we have gone in and audited that, done a peer review of the results. That's our function for you all as a board. And so we're here to talk to you about the results of our actual audit. There we go. All right, just a quick reminder, Milliman's been serving in this peer review role for 12 or 13 years now. In order to kind of give, since it's an audit function and you're really looking for different unique perspectives, last year Scott and I stepped in to kind of lead the audit team to give you a little bit kind of fresh set of eyes as we review the OSA work. Dan and Gary are actually the brains behind the brawn and do a lot of the heavy lifting kind of behind the scenes, and they're the ones that really understand and have kind of a deep institutional knowledge about your plans. Been working with you all for a while. So so with our team, you know, beyond our experience working with the state, we do this type of actual audit function for plans across the country, and while also serving as kind of the consulting actuary for a lot of other statewide plans. So we're familiar with this audit process, both from being kind of the retained actuary as well as kind of from the audit side. So diving into this specific engagement, again, the OSA completed the 2025 actual evaluation. And so our job really was to replicate the whole process. We looked at the data that went into the evaluation process. We looked at the assumptions. As you all recall, 6 months ago, there was, we came and presented to you on the results of the demographic assumptions, the assumption setting process. But it's important to continue to monitor the assumptions because our actuarial standards don't say the assumptions need to be reasonable every time you do an experience study. They need to be reasonable every valuation that's completed. So it's important that every time we do an audit, even if it's not an experience study, to look at the assumptions, and we did that. And then we replicated the liabilities, we replicated the asset calculations, and ultimately replicated the contribution rates that are calculated as part of the valuation. And so that the key finding, kind of the headline, which you want to hear as part of this presentation, is that we have completed that peer review of the 25 evaluation and the contribution rate calculations that resulted from it. And we believe those calculations are accurate and reasonable and are appropriate for your discussions that'll be coming up later about what the right contribution levels are for your plan. And we're not recommending any changes, just supporting the calculations that have been performed. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Scott to kind of walk through some of those different steps.
Okay. Yeah, I'll give a little bit more detail on the different sections kind of included in our replication, and happy to answer any questions along the way, certainly. Starting with benefits, assumptions, methods, kind of the foundation for the valuation. We confirmed that we think the valuation is reflecting the benefits in the statute. No big changes compared to our prior audit. Most recent kind of relevant change was the SHB 1701, but that was included in our prior audit as well. So we agree with the benefits being valued. We reviewed the methods and assumptions. As Ryan said, we already discussed the demographic assumption and the experience study late last year with you. We also looked over the economic assumptions, including the 7.25% investment return, compared that to kind of what, given the asset allocation, comes out of a separate model that we have. It's very consistent. So again, everything seems reasonable for purposes of the valuation as a starting point, which is great and is what you want to see. Moving to the next slide, we received data independently from DRS, received that, kind of compiled it, put it together, compared that to the final valuation provided by the Office of the State Actuary, made sure everything was consistent. It was incredibly consistent, as you can see here. We'd expect some differences, just knowing that OSA is going to do some more data editing and processing, and so you can see little differences, and we wouldn't be concerned about that, but they're really minor in this case. So again, we felt the data being used in the valuation made sense and was consistent with source data. Similar on the assets, we independently did the asset calculations, smooth value of assets used in the valuation, made sure everything was verified, and that we got very close doing similar calculations on our end from the source material. So again, no concerns on that front. And then liabilities, which is where we spend more of the time. As noted here in the table and in the first line, we had a very good match, 100.0%, which is not usually what we see in an audit. So this is about as encouraging a replication as you can see on that front. And you can see there's little ups and downs in certain subcategories, but I mean, often when we're doing this, if we're within a couple percent, it's a very close match, given that we are doing this independently. And so, I mean, part of this is we do have a depth of knowledge of your system of having done this before, but also we have a very good collaboration with the Office of State Actuary. I got our questions answered very well. So it just speaks to being able to then really understand what they're doing, feel comfortable with it, and replicate it well. So again, a great result on that front. Okay. And then that feeds into the contribution rates. So again, we independently, based on our independent calculation of liabilities and assets, chased all that through the contribution calculation, both the aggregate number basis for the employee contribution rate and the minimum employee rate based off of the entry age calculation, and down to sort of the employee, employer, and state split. Again, as shown here, very close match kind of across the board. Our numbers are just for, validation and confirmation. Obviously, the OSA numbers are the official ones that will be in the valuation. But again, just as you would expect, given all the components match so well, really did replicate the results quite well. And then considering sort of what has changed since the prior audit, just for kind of for the record, we reflected all the new assumption changes from the recent experience studies. Again, kind of validated that we felt those assumptions were accurate. Incorporated the new investment return, the new economic assumptions, the retirement rates, other demographic assumptions, and built in the 4 basis point payroll, 4 basis point increase on administrative expenses built into the valuation now.
Yeah, and so just to wrap it up, really the biggest takeaway we have, obviously the headline that everything was reasonable. And I guess what we wanted to leave with is just to say that this board has a funding policy you've set a goal on how you want to pay pay for the benefits for this plan. You have the aggregate contribution rate. There's a minimum contribution rate that work together to meet the goals this board set for funding the plan around contribution stability, around kind of intergenerational equity, and all the different kind of challenges and goals you can have with a funding policy. This board has a funding policy. And the decision's been made to fund at a level less than that. And that's within, the purview of this board. And so just keeping in mind, it's important to understand what the potential, how does that impact those goals you're trying to meet as far as funding the benefits over different periods of time. If you're going to fund it less than that funding policy, just to engage with the OSA to understand what the potential ramifications of that are, how that might rebalance some of your priorities. And you'll be talking about contribution rates next. It's my understanding in October, there'll be some projections that kind of incorporate what the impact of funding it less than the funding policy rate is, just to understand. Is it going to allow you to stay on the path of fully funding your benefits, but maybe a little bit slower than you like? Or if it's not at the right level, actually you could be losing ground a little bit, just to kind of understand what the ramifications of funding at less than the funding policy rate, just to keep that conversation going. I understand there's budget challenges, and it's more just as a board understanding the ramifications at funding different than the funding policy you have. So with that, we're happy to answer any questions, and just appreciate the opportunity to
Questions?
share this with you. Spectacular.
I like
Thank
it.
you all.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much. All right, item number 3 on our list is the contribution rate adoption, and Jacob, make that presentation. And also for information, this will require board action, so.
So I hope you're not saving your actuarial questions for me, and we'll see. They're close by. Okay, in front of the board today, contribution rate adoption. For the record, Jacob White, staff to the board. So the board may adopt contribution rates for the 27 through 29 and 29 through 31 biennia. Luckily, they touched on some of my slides, so I'm going to be able to go through this a little quicker, which is great. Just to go over the board's funding policy. So the board's goals are to fully fund the plan and for stable contribution rates. As we've discussed in the past and kind of alluded to, was that sometimes those can be in conflict. And so I'm going to do my best to help walk through the options today and put the pros and cons of the different options in front of you today for that discussion of how to balance those board goals. So board has a 4-year rate adoption policy, and then the adopted rates may still be updated with each new rate setting valuation. So the current statutory minimum rate funding policy, not going to read through the whole thing, but just to show that it is complex, and they did touch on some of that, break that down a bit more in the previous presentation. And we'll talk about it more as we go through here. Okay, so we've got the aggregate and the minimum rates. The under the plan funding policy, the contribution rate is the greater of the 2 rates. The aggregate rates goal is for contribution rates for adequacy. The actual cost method for the plan, this was the plan's original method. It's the method used by all the other plans. Some of the concerns the board has had historically about using the aggregate rate is it can fluctuate with plan experience and changes in assets. It is much more susceptible to investment returns on a year-to-year basis. And so led to the board setting that goal of having more stable rates and looking for solutions to have those stable rates. And so in trying to meet that goal, the board developed over time its minimum rate policy that put more focus on the stability of rates. And then over time, the board added different tiers of rates based on the funded status. And so in part what this was seeking to address was as the funding ratio of the plan went over 100% and then kept going up, it was the board recognizing that there needed to be a way to bring that back down towards closer towards 100%. Fund it to avoid a situation like has occurred with LEOFF 1, where you end up with an overfunded plan. So I'm going to be throwing lots of numbers at you today. These are what the board had previously adopted, and really the thing to focus on here is the current rate is 8.53%. And as part of the 4-year rate adoption, we can see what the rates that were expected for the next 2 years. And so really focusing on 8.66%, because in the slides to come, you'll see how that changes with the new actuarial valuation report and the options in front of you today. So here's what the board actually adopted last time. So the board, the minimum rate was in the last valuation was 9.2% for the member rate. And recognizing in part the state budget issues at that time, the board decided to do step increases towards a goal of meeting that minimum rate by 2032. So that's the path the board has been on. And actuaries from Milliman did a good job of kind of going through this already. But just as a reminder, that the result of the actual evaluation, we saw salaries increased higher than assumed, new retirements were higher than expected. And then on the good news column, investment returns exceeded expectations. And so here's a breakdown of how that impacted the funded status. Went from 101.6 to 100.3%. And this does include the some economic and demographic assumption changes the board adopted last year. Okay, so here, going to just focus on the member contribution rates. Once again, the rate that was adopted previously by the board for next year is 8.66%. Out of the actual valuation report, we see that the aggregate rate is now 10.47%, and the minimum rate would go to 9.87%. And then I asked the actuaries to help us out with just seeing, like, what does that look like for the state in terms of overall budget impact? And so this is showing the highest of those numbers, the aggregate rate. And you can see down in the bottom corner, close to the bottom corner there, that it would be the change in rates to, if the board were to adopt immediately up to the aggregate rate for next year, it would be a $51 million impact to the state budget over the biennium. So not just for next year, but the biennium. And then wanted to touch on some other impacts to consider for the board to consider when weighing this decision. So the funding method, the board has, like I said, the board has historically used the minimum rate. However, the aggregate rate has typically been lower, not higher than that rate. But I think the goals still apply of the minimum rate tending to be the more stable of the two. Although I should say that with the tiers added, that might not always be the case in the future, but the board has historically used the minimum rate to this point. The state budget, I think everyone's well aware, expecting another difficult budget year this year at the legislature, and the state portion of contribution rates is paid out of the general fund. There still are deferred gains of 1.1 billion that are going to be recognized over they're still being smoothed out over the next 3 years. And then should add it does look like there were a good and higher than expected investment returns next year. And so if that all comes to fruition the way it appears it will, then those will also be added to this and smoothed out over the next 4 years, I believe. And then projected rates, the aggregate rate, just to kind of demonstrate the volatility of it, while it is projected in this AVR to go up to 10 point, or not projected, it does go up to 10.47%. It's projected to go back down to 9.5%. And so this was something Mitch talked about in the last board meeting. But something to keep in mind, if you were to jump all the way up to the aggregate rate, then you might be turning around and coming back down to 9.5 if everything plays out how it's supposed to. While the minimum rate is projected to remain more stable. Okay, so now we get to the options. First option is to adopt the minimum rate for the 27, 29, and 29, 31 biennia. That would be at the 9.87% for member rate. This would allow the board to capture more potential investment gains than the current, if you stayed at the current rate. It lowers the risk of the plan, decreasing funded ratio, and could prevent, by doing so, you could prevent the need for higher rate increases in the future if there is a bad experience. The cons are the rates would go up immediately. It would go up sharply. And that with the state's budget concerns going into next year is obviously something to keep in mind. Option 2 is to go even higher. So this is to adopt the aggregate rate for the next 2 biennia to 10.47%. These rates fully reflect the recent plan experience. They capture all potential investment gains and lower the lowest risk as far as the plan's funded ratio falling below 100%. Cons, doesn't meet the goal of rate stability. Like I showed on the previous slide, the recommendation could be to immediately go back down. And then it's going to increase contribution rates for members, employers, and have the biggest impact on the state budget of any of the options in front of you today. Okay, so option 3 is to step into the new minimum rate by 2032. So this updates that table that I showed you that the board previously adopted, keeps the same goal date of 2032 to reach the full minimum rate, but it adjusts that minimum rate from 9.2 to 9.87 to the new minimum rate. And then it changes the steps up year to year to match that. So the pros of this is smooth rate increases over the next 6 years, gives members, employers, the state an opportunity to plan for these increased rates. However, it does increase the risk of underfunding the plan and then needing to increase rates further to make up for any lost investment returns. Yeah. And here's just a breakdown of what that looks like year by year. The member rate you can see there year by year. And so when the board does adopt this, the board can revisit that. So if need to make a more, if experience plays out in a way in which you feel it's necessary to raise the rates, we can do that later. If the state's fiscal budget situation changes, you can choose to raise rates at that time where it might be more palatable to do so. So it does continue to provide you flexibility in adopting this rate or this table. So action in front of the board today, you got option 1, option 2, and option 3. Happy to go back if you need to look at the tables or anything, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Go ahead and open up for questions.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Can you explain, Jacob, the 9.5 you were talking about and how that 9.87 would compare and how we come out? What are those 2 different rates that we go with, the minimum and the aggregate?
Yeah, so the 9.5, I believe that was the previous minimum rate adopted by the board under the previous AVR. Is that correct? That's what you're, or that was 9.2.
I think there was something about it would come down to 9.5. Which rate is that?
I'm sorry, that was the aggregate rate. So that was if you adopted the aggregate rate, the projections from the actuaries were that it would then need to come down if everything played out how it's supposed to.
And that's without including any gains from this last year, I think.
Yeah, nothing from this last year.
Okay, thank
just
you.
the smoothed out ones. Okay.
Just to follow up on that, so that would be the 10.47, right, increase?
Yes.
Then it's the projection then would be dropped down to 9.5.
Yeah, and that's not included in any of the.
Got it. I just want to make sure I understood.
Yep.
Thank you. Questions? Yeah, Senator.
Well, just to put it, I guess, into colloquial terms, the option 2 is ripping the Band-Aid off. Option 3 is trying to make it as painless as possible over a period of time. It just depends on how we want to approach the issue. Is that, am I getting to it?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Motion?
Sure.
Mr. Chair, I move option 3. for the salary or the contribution rate.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded for option number 3, which is the adopt option 3 rate table, stepping into minimum rate of 9.87 by 2032.
Just to follow up on it through what we see on the screen and also listening to the presentation, the amount of money we have in savings and also the returns that are coming back are looking to that we'd have to probably adjust later down the road if we tried to go to the higher one. This one actually works to actually smooth the contribution rates to where the employees as well as the employers are not hit harder as we go forward. So we can adjust it any time if we have to, and I think this is a better way of looking at how we do it this time.
Thank you, Pat. Other comments, questions? Seeing none, all those in favor of adopting option number 3, say aye.
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 Opposed? Option 3 is adopted. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Item number 4 on the list is the salary setting authority, and Karen is going to make a presentation. So welcome, Karen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board in person, and AJ. We are tearing up the agenda today, so y'all are taking that seriously, and I like it. My name for the record, Karen Durant, staff to the board. Quickly, the background, you've received briefings in April, May, and June. You adopted the consultant's recommendations for salary range market structure adjustments of 8% for the executive director, deputy director, and 2.6% for the research and policy positions. Here's a reminder of the board adopted salary structure from the June meeting. And here is the structure along with current salaries. The current pay does include the 7/1/26 general wage increase of 2%. Here's a reminder of your current adopted timeline outlining the sequencing to have the ongoing process align with appropriated fund budget submittal process. I would like to draw attention to the first box for performance evaluations. The current process aligns with a calendar year evaluation. For the process to reflect the most current performance of team members, consideration should be given to changing the process to have up-to-date evaluations aligned with fiscal year or just before board decisions are made. In addition, since the board has a non-appropriated budget, the August work would include working with OFM on an adjustment to expenditure authority. The board would still submit a decision package to OFM, so the budget system would be aligned with the expenditure authority. If the board adopted the changes, the process would look like this. The sequencing of the process remains the same, except evaluations would move to reflect the most current performance for better alignment with decisions. Also, the process more accurately reflects the non-appropriated budget of the board. Specific months are not included as the process may be more fluid and flexible depending on the timing of board meetings. For example, this year, the board made some decisions on structure in June. The meeting was very late in the month, so even though the timeline currently has specific months listed, the process is more for sequencing. This change would allow the board more flexibility in timing for decisions. A change would require board action. Next steps, board action for process changes, executive session to discuss performance of employees, possible board action for any specific increases. I would like to mention that the salary setting presentations for next year and during odd numbered years will be limited to adopting any process change and showing the board the revised salary structure with inflation index applied. The board could request to add review of staff performance. The board will continue to have an annual evaluation of the executive director, with the evaluation taking place in the May-June timeframe. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Open up for questions and or direction.
Question, Mr. Chair.
Sure, go ahead.
Yes, thanks for your work on this, Karen. This is a question really kind of meant to illuminate this process, and if the board was to move forward with these, a more salary setting process that kind of makes sense for what we're trying to achieve here, is that in line with industry standards, other boards of our size, institutions, et cetera?
It's fairly standard practice to have performance considered in salary increases. So this would just make that formal process aligned with the actual decision making.
Perfect, thank you.
Other questions? Direction then.
Mr. Chair,
Go ahead.
I'd like to make a motion for a process change to the board salary setting process. So I move to adopt the board salary setting authority process per slide 6, just one's up of the presentation to move us forward.
Motion's been made and seconded to adopt the proposed board salary setting process. Discussion. Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion's adopted. Way to go, Karen.
Thanks.
Can you laminate this for us?
Yeah.
I will. Careful what you ask for.
Yeah. All right. Got it right. Yeah, I gotta find my little cheat sheet here. There we go. All right. The board will now be going into executive session at looks like 10:05 to discuss the performance of public employees. The regular open public meeting will reconvene at 10:35. So we'll be in there for 30 minutes. Trustees that are going to join us remotely, please use the executive session meeting link. So AJ, find that link, jump on, and we'll be in there in a few seconds. So again, we'll be back at 10:35. For those who are not going to stick around, thank you for being here. Good to see you guys. So, all right, we'll be recessed to executive session. All right, we'll go ahead and reconvene our July 22nd, 2026 meeting. And on our agenda is item number 6, which is the 2025-2027 operating budget update. And Karen, you're back. Thank you.
Good morning again, Chair Lawson and members of the board, Karen Durant, staff to the board. Today we'll be just doing a refresher and an update on the current biennial budget. By way of background, the left to expense account, Fund 4 at 548, is created in statute under 4126-732. The board fund is not subject to appropriation through the budget process, but expenditures are subject to review and approval by the Office of Financial Management. Board expenses come from the trust fund. It is a best practice to notify the board and approve changes. The left board budget is in support of your fiduciary responsibilities. Some of the items include board meetings, member and stakeholder communications and outreach, trustee and staff professional development, contracts for services, and agency operations. This is a depiction of draft fiscal year 2026 close. That won't be final until September. As you can see, we are running a tight budget, but we have a variance of about 5.6% currently. And this is the biennial budget update for the projections on the allotments that you guys have already adopted, which will leave us with a surplus of about 3% at the end of the biennium. Board action options is to adopt any changes that you think that need to be made in objects of expenditure or no further action, and we can monitor and bring it back to you if necessary. Be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? So no action is simply no action for us. All right. Thanks, Karen. Oh, we've been waiting for this one. Item number 7. We're going to engage in the Open Public Meeting Act training, and we have Kate, our assigned AG, is going to do this. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you very much, Chair Lawson and members of the board. I apologize, I'm going to do a multi-screen thing here, so you'll see a lot of my profile, but I'll try and look folks in the face. This is your Open Public Meetings Act refresher. You get to have this every 4 years by statute. This presentation is a general overview. It's got some summary statements in it. It's meant to be digestible. It is not a history lesson. It is a general overview of the items that you as a committee are most likely to encounter and need to know about. It's not intended to be legal advice. Sorry about the required disclaimer. So it's not something that you can rely on in all contexts. If you have any questions, please contact me for specific advice. Many OPMA issues are highly fact specific. And I'm sorry, I'm going to lower my chair. There we go. So the OPMA is found in chapter 4230. It's short, it's worth a read. I've given you a selection here of the legislative intent, and this is the lens through which the entire act should be viewed. I would summarize the purpose of the legislative intent as avoiding hidden decisions, making sure that government is conducted in the open and without any filtering. The OPMA includes this interpretive mandate that it should be liberally construed. Its exemptions must be narrowly construed. So executive session being an exemption would be narrowly construed, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Liberal construction does not mean disregard the actual language of the statute. It means that we don't get hung up on or give it a hyper-technical reading. So we apply the plain language. If there's ambiguity, we interpret it in favor of the purpose of the legislation, which is open meetings, open disclosure, public disclosure. A narrow construction, conversely, is a literal, restrictive, very specific construction. We still don't get hung up on the language, but we do assume that the legislature meant what it said, and we stick to it. The OPMA in general applies to agency meetings. Now, there's a little bit of ambiguity in the statute in terms of how they're defining what all the elements are. But in general, we can say that anytime there is a majority of members of the governing body and they conduct any of the body's official business, that constitutes an agency meeting, and that's when the OPMA will apply. An agency is any multi-person body, including you, if it's created by statute and serves a statewide function. It applies to subcommittees of an agency or a multi-person body if the subcommittee acts on behalf of the governing body or conducts certain activities like conducting hearings or taking public comment. A meeting in general, short, requires quorum plus action. Without action, the gathering does not meet the definition of a meeting. So you can meet, you can go to a party, you can chat after executive session, you can travel together, so long as you're not taking action, you will not run afoul of the OPMA. So what is action? Well, here in our little word bubble here, it's any decision, discussion on any topic within your purview, any receipt of public comments. The statute uses all the words that I have in the bubble here: consider, discuss, review, deliberate, decide. This is an evidence of legislative intent to capture really everything that you do. So you can see that it's really quite broad. This is all action. It's not final action, but it's all action. Passive receipt of information is okay, like an educational presentation. So even if there was a quorum present, you could sit and passively receive information. However, you can imagine how that could slide into the conduct of business. Somebody asks a question or a leading question, could be the same thing as expressing an opinion, and now you've actually started deliberating without intending to. So if you've got an intent to maybe gather without conducting business, you might want to check in with us first and see if we can make sure that we have the parameters in place to avoid violating the OPMA. One thing to be careful of is a meeting without a meeting. So if there's a quorum in any business conducted, you've had a meeting. So there are a number of Washington cases that discuss how you can have a meeting without actually being seated in the room together. These are things like a group email where some of the recipients respond with their thoughts. Another example might be a committee member who's canvassing votes on a specific issue where they've informed the people that they're talking with, all the other members of the committee, that they are intending to go to every member and get information on the votes. This leads to the factual question in these circumstances: is there a collective intent to do business? And of course, if the person you're speaking with is aware that you're going to everybody to canvass votes, there you have a collective intent to do business. This is a violation of the OPMA. And so one way you can avoid these kinds of problems is to cultivate a culture of open action. If you intend to discuss anything that has to do with your job here for the board, you would do it in a public meeting as your default. I have to say, please feel free to, raise your hand if you have questions. This is just an articulation of some of the requirements of regular versus special meetings. Notice of a regular meeting has to be published annually in the state register. Changes have to be published at least 20 days in advance. A special meeting has to be published 30 days in advance and specifically include the topics under discussion. There are limits on spontaneous final action that can occur in a special meeting. If you have a regular meeting, you can modify the agenda on the fly and make a final action, discuss and take final action even on anything you'd like to. If you are in a special meeting, you need to stick to the topics that have been identified in the agenda. The big exception to the Open Public Meetings Act is, as we've already exercised today, our executive sessions. This happens, we make a statutory announcement. Actually, the chair make a statutory announcement. We take no final actions. The statutory announcement and the agenda would include the reason for the executive session, and that's also identified in the minutes, because if we've changed the agenda on the fly and we're going into executive session, we want to record in the minutes why we went into executive session. The underlying justification of executive session is that public disclosure of certain matters could cause private or public harm. Therefore, executive sessions are confidential. What's discussed there is meant to be kept confidential. Remember that executive sessions are the exception, not the rule, and so we stick very closely to the purpose of executive sessions. I've summarized and simplified probably the most likely exceptions that would apply to this body. Number one is essentially hacking and data breaches. Number two is talking about public contract negotiations. Number three, complaints or charges against an employee. Number four is employee performance reviews. The fifth bullet down there is discussing litigation matters. Note that each of these, even as I summarize them, has an if or a but or an unless, and those matter and those must be met. So you don't discuss IT and structure and security unless public disclosure increases risks and the body is in compliance with specific statutory notice requirements regarding the data breaches. So it's important in these executive session exceptions to read the entire language, statutory language of each exception and make sure the entire exception applies. One thing that's important to do in executive sessions and also in special meetings is to stick to the script. Action should be limited in a special meeting to those ideas or those topics expressly identified in the agenda. Same thing with executive sessions. Don't drift off into related subjects. So for example, there's a couple of cases out there where folks have gone awry in a special meeting. For example, in recall of bird, the council met to discuss local control is what they had in the agenda, but they actually voted on mask wearing mandate, and that was found to be not specific enough for a special meeting. Executive session, don't meander off topic. So in Walla Westby, Walla Walla, the council met to discuss hiring an individual. Actually, they were going to discuss the top 5 candidates, and they ended up deciding in the meeting, no, we all really prefer candidate A. And they'd essentially decided in the meeting that we're going to hire candidate A. And they went out and they had the final meeting in public. But effectively, the executive session was final action. It was decision, and it was outside the context of it was an action that was taken,
Yes.
and that was found to be a violation of the OPMA.
Okay, I think we had a question.
Kate, I've got a question and I'm not sure how how I can present it because it seems like it's almost like a catch-22. So we go in an executive session. There's RCW's read on what we're going to discuss that in there. And then we get some of these items come out. I said, well, you violated the Open Meeting Act. If there's no notes taken in an executive session, how does anybody know that you didn't discuss what you're doing? And how did these violations come about?
Well, I would have to assume that it would be reported in some way. Either there are minutes, a staff member, a member of the committee for some reason, or that a decision happens.
So they violated their own confidentiality.
Possibly, or a decision happens, for example, where this employee was hired, right? The aggrieved individual might do some litigation, might do some discovery and find out what occurred. So
How can they do that if once you go in an executive session, everything's under confidentiality and you're not supposed to discuss it? And if somebody does give it up, shouldn't that person be in violation of the executive session laws? Because this is the one thing that always gets me, because this is where people they get crazy over some of this stuff, because things do sometimes drift, but they don't. But if nobody's taking any notes and there's nothing comes out, how would they even find out about it unless somebody violated the confidentiality of an executive session?
yeah, so I mean, I can't speak to all circumstances, but I can say, for example, if litigation had been started, all of these requirements and exceptions can be overridden by a court order. So a court order requiring testimony regarding, yeah, even if it's confidential, right? It could be with particular protections in place, but sure.
Yes, sir.
I was just going to say, in my time, I have seen an elected official unintentionally violate an executive session. They were having a conversation, something slipped out. They didn't mean it. They couldn't take it back. And then someone in the community heard it and said, that's a violation. They put in a OPMA challenge and they were fined for it. So I think even in the best circumstances, which is why we have this training, is just really important that we all remember to be really, really careful with our conversations, because things can happen unintentionally. And I've seen it happen.
I guess this would be as close as I get to historical element to my presentation. In 2022, there were some changes to the OPMA to really encourage and protect public participation to make sure it's easier, sort of a combination of COVID exigencies and a focus on supporting public comments. So this is additional language from the intent section. Public agencies are encouraged to incorporate and accept public comments during the decision-making process. That does not mean public comments during a meeting. It just means following the process, allowing for public comments, which can occur. And when we say at every regular meeting, the statute specifically requires or authorizes public comments to be taken in a more organized fashion prior to a meeting and then distributed to members rather than at the public meeting itself. So the statutory language is an opportunity at or before every regular meeting at which a final action is taken. So if no final action is taken and no public comments are accepted prior to the meeting, this would actually be authorized under the statute. But then you'd have to be super careful to not take final action. So it's best just to continue with the process that you have, which is to receive public comment prior to a meeting and distribute that to the members. All right, violations. Actions taken in violation of the OPMA are void. That means they have no legal effect. Subsequent actions related to that action would be unauthorized and void. Knowing violation of the OPMA is a civil violation with a monetary penalty. Knowing is presumed from the fact of receiving training. You're welcome. However, an attorney opinion allows you to have good faith reliance. So if there's a situation that you're unclear about, please check with me in advance and I'm happy to provide you an opinion. And if I'm wrong, I'm retiring soon anyways. No, all right. Can you make it right? Well, as to the validity of the final action, possibly, but it's a fact-specific inquiry. In short, it requires you to redo the entire process with full public participation or in public view. But a simple ratification of a prior action that was void would not be effective. The ratification would also be void. So, like I said, you sort of have to rewind to do it all over again at a public meeting. But as to a knowing violation, no. Once the violation has occurred, it cannot be cured. And I believe I spoke faster than I intended, but slower than I usually do. So are there any other questions?
Questions? All right. Thank you. You did a good job.
Thank you, sir.
Appreciate it. Right. Item number 8 on our list is the Public Safety Exposure Records Retention Comprehensive Report. And Tim's coming forward. Morning, Tim.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board, Tim Valencia, staff for the board. This is agenda item 8, preservation of public safety exposure records. This is the comprehensive report. The preservation of occupational exposure records presents a growing policy challenge as disability claims, occupational disease claims, and statutory presumptions increasingly involve conditions that emerge years or decades after an underlying exposure has occurred. This issue affects not only records management, but also the administration of disability benefits, workers' compensation benefits, survivor benefits, and occupational disease presumptions. So the availability or absence of records may materialize or may materially influence future claims and adjudication of public, and affect confidence in those systems. So it's not directly a pension issue, but it's a pension adjacent issue because it does affect benefits for members and survivors of the systems. Occupational health sciences has been advancing over the decades and seems to be increasing even more so. And so as the statutory presumptions continue to evolve, policymakers may wish to consider whether the record retention policies adequately preserve the evidence needed to support fair and consistent decision making for left Plan 2 members. So today's presentation, this presentation builds on the June 30th initial report, which you received, which had a lot of the core research about the records and about this, the underlying of this issue. So I'm not going to repeat all of that detail. Rather, I'll do some summarization of that and focus more along with that, the additional research that I've added into the report, and then present several policy options for your consideration. At the end, we'll be looking for direction from the board on how to proceed if you want to take further actions on this issue. So the one thing I will repeat is the core issue statement from the report. So the evidence needed to evaluate disability, occupational disease, and survivor benefit claims may be incomplete, unavailable, or difficult to reconstruct due to varied retention records retention practices. So again, one of the key messages here is that it's not entirely about whether records are retained, because there are a lot of records retained. The bigger challenge tends to be whether or not they remain available long enough to be able to support a future claim. And as I'll talk about in this report, there's often some timeline mismatches, and there's a couple of reasons for that. So as I said, I did add, and you may have noticed in the report, I added quite a bit more detail in terms of the depth on the report, and it supported all the kind of we'll call it the key headlines that were present in the initial report. So one of the first big headlines is that there are evidentiary gaps in the public safety exposure record. That was the first question. Is there actually a gap here? And yeah, there is, and the report the new information further supported that. So occupational diseases and long-term disabilities, as I said, often surface decades after hazardous exposures occur on the job. And in some cases, it may be multiple exposures over time that are never actually documented. And oftentimes the records are already destroyed under the record retention rules that exist in the state. The records may be destroyed before they can actually be used in a future claim, because some records can be destroyed as early as 5 years or 7 years, according to the current record retention rules. There is a burden of proof on these cases, particularly if the records have already been destroyed. The burden of proof is completely on the member at that point to be able to try and justify what happened with the claim, and which in many cases it's virtually impossible to actually have substantiated records. And then I mentioned the flawed timeline retentions, that when you think about it, when you have records that are only being retained 5, 7, maybe 15 years, you may need a much longer timeline to be usable, because if you think about a 25-year career and then 30 years in retirement, you're talking about a 55-year time span where the records may be relevant, but they often aren't kept that long, and often finding them across different employers and different sources is very, very difficult. Which takes me to the second headline, which is that the records related to this are very fragmented and unstandardized. So exposure records are highly decentralized. There's no single career-long exposure repository that exists for public safety. There's inconsistent practices, the different documentation standards, retention policies, the tracking procedures vary heavily among departments, agencies, and municipalities. I was looking through just specifically trying to find the practices of I was looking at 10 different major agencies, particularly on the law enforcement side, and for each one, references to how they're documenting exposure was located in 4 or 5 different policies, and they all handled it very, very differently. So if you take for one person at one agency, it can be very difficult to go find some records or obtain these records. But if you have somebody who has moved from multiple agencies with multiple practices, that lack of standardization and that fragmentation would make it very difficult to find supporting documentation that they may need for a claim. There was also a professional imbalance, and by that I looked at comparisons between police and fire practices. The fire exposure documentation is much stronger because there's been a culture of looking at cancer presumptions for several years. So there's been a body of work already looking at firefighter exposure, such as the report that I had in my report from 2015-2016, which specifically was a legislative report looking at firefighter exposure reporting. But on the law enforcement side, there just isn't that level of information available. It's much less standardized. There isn't the amount of report that has or amount of work that has gone into the reporting for the law enforcement side. So a big professional imbalance that exists. So there is definitely, it would actually take some action to create something that would be much more standardized statewide. But it would take a lot of work to really evaluate all the standards, to really look into them, to look at maybe if you wanted to change the retention standards. You saw the tables on the different records retentions. Being able to create something standardized. There's a lot of work that could go in there, and plus with any policy thing, again, even though it wouldn't necessarily have policy impacts, there could be from the employer side administrative costs if you were making changes, and to that cost, not just the cost of storage, but just the cost of implementing and changing systems and processes and training and all that. So there's some areas where there's definitely room for policy exploration as a result of what we're seeing right now out in the environment. So the additional research that I did expand in the analysis, and those summaries all support the statements that I just made. Since the initial report, the things that I added into this report was that I did a gap analysis on the records retentions and the issues therein, specifically for law enforcement. I did specifically for firefighters. I did a comparison of the police and fire to show the gap between the two types of systems. I did expand the review of the Washington retention rules, in particular the exposure reporting requirements under WAC Chapter 296-802. There's quite a bit of detail there in the report as well, and then, of course, with all that additional information, that led to the development of some options for the board. So before we look at the board, I tried to break all that information down into fairly large reports. I tried to break it down into kind of 5 principal findings that I had in there. So these should sound pretty similar to what I've already been saying. The first one was that there's definitely occupational disease latency that often exceeds the record retention periods. So just that timeline mismatch. Exposure documentation is fragmented across numerous systems, both in where the records are and how the employers manage those. Law enforcement exposure documentation is significantly less standardized than the fire side, and firefighters are a lot stronger, but like with law enforcement, it lacks a statewide career exposure mandate. But they do have some actual systems in place, like the PEERS system for capturing exposures, but it's self-reporting. It's not a mandated system. And again, the current retention schedules that are out there, even though a lot of the records are kept, they weren't developed for managing disability claims or supporting disability claims. They were developed for administrative purposes and management purposes. So that's why there's a mismatch to this purpose, which is maintaining records for exposure purposes. So with that, so these options are provided to assist the board in evaluating a range of potential approaches from maintaining the current framework to pursuing a more comprehensive change, which would be all the way up to legislation. So these options are intended to inform the discussion should the board determine that more action is warranted. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. So option one really is the status quo kind of baseline option. Under this approach, the board would not take any immediate legislative or regulatory action on this topic. It would mean, though, that we would continue to monitor this topic. We would continue to watch, more specifically look at disability claims and the trends in occupational health and sciences, and maybe get a better sense of how big this issue is, how many claims are being maybe turned down because we don't have enough evidence. So it'd just be a watch and see sort of approach in that regard. So, I mean, some clear benefits from this path is that, it doesn't put any, new burden or cost on the employer side, for training, implementation, record seizing, any of that. And it also gives more time to just study this shifting environment. As I said, it's an evolving, growing area. But on the downside of that, though, there's significant risks. If you maintain just the status quo, it doesn't solve the issue. It doesn't do anything to resolve the structural gaps that exist. So members still will be in the same position where they may not have records necessary to change their options, and we're not really doing anything to influence the issue at all. So nothing really changes under this option, but it may mean that we look at it and that you take up action in the future. So option 2 steps up the intervention, and it recommends a comprehensive formal study of the issue, and to differentiate from this comprehensive. This is more, think of it in the model of the 2015 firefighter report on exposure reporting. This would likely be, it'd be something that would be a multi-agency work group, probably legislatively mandated. So it'd be a big formal study, delving much deeper into this and looking towards making recommendations. So it certainly would provide a much more complete factual foundation for considering change. It allows stakeholders to be involved in the process. So the stakeholders, other professionals, labor and industries, DRS, our ombuds, people that have some input on this area. So it brings all the players to the table. And of course builds on the existing bodies of report. But a big study would require a lot of staff time and resources, not only of this board, but of the other organizations. I imagine WACOPS would have some people involved. Council firefighters may have people involved. LNI would have people involved. So there are staff times and resources for this organization and other organizations to be able to get such multi-agency cooperation. That may require legislation. So that's, again, another commitment, in political capital exposure as well. So the board needs to consider if that's something they want to look at. And it doesn't immediately address the issue. It would study it. It delays any immediate implementation. And the recommendations may not even actually lead to options. I know that 2015 legislative study on the fire side, even though some good things came out of that and some identification and reporting and some wax on exposure definition, even that work group couldn't come to a consensus on mandating exposure reporting. So it may or may not actually lead to what we're trying to deal with here. So option 3 is we'll go to the is the largest or the largest commitment, I suppose we'll call it. So this is the statutory a proactive statutory approach. So this option pursues formal legislative changes to establish mandatory, uniform, statewide minimum retention requirements specifically for public safety. So this option solves the core problem, by legally expanding the retention timelines to match the latency periods of these disability claims. It ensures, I say ensures, I shouldn't say it ensures, but it creates the opportunity for consistency across jurisdictions and employers, because it's creating one standard that everybody should be working towards and applying to. And thus, it reduces the evidentiary disparity between both professions and employers. So it should improve the availability of evidence for claims as a result. But as I said, it would require legislation. to be able to create such a records requirement. And again, it may create costs for employers. There's going to be probably, again, storage, training, implementation, because it may change their internal system. So there may be some costs there to be taken under consideration. And it doesn't necessarily ensure consistent practices will actually be deployed across the employers, even though it sets a consistent standard. So, so those are the three options that I brought forward to you today. Some consideration, some questions for consideration are does the board want to take further action on this topic? And what is your role in this particular policy development? What other stakeholders should be involved in this issue beyond the board? Should others have say in that versus just the board? Is there, how much deeper should the research be from a statewide basis? And does this rise to the level of needing, legislative options to move forward? So I will wrap this up, coming to conclusion here, maybe. So again, the purpose of this presentation was to provide the board with additional research and a range of potential approaches should it determine that further action is warranted. So staff is looking for, formal directive to shape our next steps. So you could choose to just accept the report and just take no action, which would effectively table this issue, and we wouldn't be following this, tracking this, or looking at it unless it came up in the future at some point. You could direct us if you have some additional questions or some other policy options that you want explored beyond these three. You could direct us to do a follow-up comprehensive report to provide additional information or options. Or you could take a motion for one of the three policy options presented. So you have three distinct paths. Option one accepts the risks of the status quo and just maintains the local level of control. Option two authorizes staff to begin scoping a comprehensive multi-agency study. And option three directs staff to create a unified legislative proposal to create a statewide standardized retention program. So we're prepared to execute whichever directive the board deems appropriate. Well, I'll say thank you, and I'll open up to the floor for discussion or questions.
Thank you, Tim. AJ, I see you're popped on. Question?
I would like to make a motion.
Okay.
I'd like to make a motion to adopt option one.
Okay. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded to adopt option number one. Yes, let's open for discussion. Go ahead, Jay.
I'm happy to support this motion, but I kind of feel like no further action is option one. Is it not? If we don't take an action, it just maintains status quo.
Just taking no action means we're not really actively continuing to monitor the issue. The option one means we're still going to have some staff commitment to continuing to monitor what's going on in this part of the industry and whether or not it's what's going on with the science, what's going on with claims, and checking how, it's a little bit more scoping of the issue versus just doing nothing at all, that we're just going to move on to something else. So there is still some staff action under option one.
All right, thanks, Tim.
So I'm kind of confused because we had no action was one, two was, Tim, can you bring up the last line? So we had no further action, and we had additional research, and then the motions was, then that's you had option 1, 2, and 3. And what you're saying, Tim, is that if we go with option 1, there's still staff work that needs to be done and time and effort, or would no action be the correct one? We've had the presentation, we've talked about it, and any further would put a workload on staff that we don't need to do at this time. So where are we at on this?
And maybe a better label for option one might have been just continue to monitor, which, and you really, no further action versus the option one. it's just an active engagement on watching what's going on and seeing if there's trends. I would be talking with the ombuds to find out, to be able to, maybe start tracking, are we finding cases? How many cases are we having where people don't have the records because they're just not available anymore and they're having bad outcomes as a result? So there would be some tracking involved, and we would start to develop information to see if it warrants coming back to go, okay, now we have a little bit more information about how big this issue really is. If you guys just don't take any actions at all or adopt any motions, then that's effectively just dropping this issue completely.
I'm wondering whether the options actually that we see, because no further action, we've seen the presentation, as I said, we've dealt with some of the stuff, but I'm almost afraid that the motions may be a little bit of mission drift for us.
Well, I think, if I may, so no further action simply becomes ignore.
Yeah.
Option one is what we're doing now, just to continue to keep a little bit of a, toe in the water,
Okay.
just to kind of monitor.
I just don't want to, anytime we start this and then there comes a slippery slope
Creep.
that
A slow creep.
the slow creep, and I'm hoping we don't run into that.
Yeah, I think that we would rely on Jacob and the team if this thing starts to get headway one way or the other. We probably have to bring everybody back at some point.
Yeah, and I think we have a good understanding of what you're expecting from just this discussion with option one is not that we commit a lot of resources to it. It's just keep aware of it.
Okay.
If we see a trend or an issue emerge, then bring it back to you. But we can keep the staff time and commitment to it low, very low.
Appreciate that.
That works for me. Thanks. Thank you.
Senator?
So, probably the operative word in option one is take immediate legislative or regulatory action on that, which means it's still on the table. It's just not, we're going to do anything today. That's my takeaway from this. If I look at this from 20,000 feet, I think from our responsibility to the members, if we know that existing inconsistencies remain, if we know that there's unequal access to documentation that remains, possibly premature destruction of records or limited ability to influence something out there that we should be able to influence, the fact that we're walking away from that completely bothers me. And just as a side note, and I know it's been an anecdotal issue for the last couple of years here is the Frank Shaw case, that it just comes to me that this might actually have impacted something like that if this were in place before, where he has some sort of a total data base out there that we could draw from. I like the idea that we are loaded up pretty good right now, running into fall. We've got X amount we're going to be able to address with the legislature. So the immediate legislative action, I understand that makes sense from a procedural point of view here. The fact we're walking away from these things, that they're in front of us, that we should be able to do nothing more than collect adequate or preserve adequate data in order to best represent our members, and completely walk away from that bothers me. So I'm willing to vote for this specifically because it's taken no action today, but it doesn't mean we're walking away from the issue.
Thank you, Senator. Jason?
I second what you're saying, Senator Holy. One of the things that I like to maintain awareness of, and we've seen this over years, where I don't want to burden our staff with other things that equate more of a fiduciary responsibility of this board. And it was stated today, as far as mission creep goes, mission creep is something that happens quite often. And I do care about this as well. It's important. I'm not sure it's my lane as a board member to, instruct, employers how they're going to retain their records or whatever that is. How that seems to be more of a collective bargaining issue for me. And also something that those groups would work with their employers, and then potentially LNI or DRS as far as that is. As far as the functions, operations of the LEOFF 2 plan, this seems outside that scope. That's kind of my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Seeing no other comments, option number one, to maintain current law and monitor the gaps. I think that's the take no immediate action, legislative or regulatory action regarding public safety records schedules. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. All right, option number one. Thank you, Tim. Thank you for
Thank
all
you.
the information. Number 9 on the list is the admin update, and Karen's back before us. We'll do it right after this. She said it's gonna be relatively short. In fact, if her report is longer than the actual presentation by the Office of the OFM, we've got a real problem. Correct. That's right. I got it going right now.
Did you start my clock? Still good morning.
Good morning.
Mr. Chair and members of the board, Karen Durant, staff to the board. The main thing that I want to discuss as part of the update today is the finalization of our every 4-year accountability audit. Monday, Chair Lawson and the auditor's office met with staff to go over the exit results. This is 3 slides from that 8-minute presentation, and I'm going to do my best to make it 10.
Killing me.
The bottom line is that there were no findings from this. The important thing to note is that the selected areas, the board operations complied with state laws, regulations, and our own policies, and provided adequate controls over safeguarding of public resources. The auditor looked at 3 areas: payroll, which included gross wages, salary increases, and compliance under your salary setting statute; accounts payable, that included disbursements, credit cards, gift cards, etc., and a general just look at the ombuds program. As I mentioned, there were no findings. There is some exit recommendations that are included in your packet. The next performance audit will be scheduled for 2030. And I want to especially recognize Jesse Jackson as our audit liaison and doing an excellent job helping to coordinate the audit. Also, special thanks to Chloe Drosby for her attention to detail in this process and providing audit support. Before I move on, are there any questions on that? What was I at? About 3 minutes? All right. Oh, geez. Okay. Moving along. Upcoming stakeholder outreach. We have Walk-Up's fall membership meeting in Spokane, September 16th through the 18th. Fiduciary education coming up, NASRA, August 8th through the 12th. IFEBP annual conference, October 25th through the 28th, and also at the same time, NCPERS public safety. Now, this is just an advertisement because I know you all are going to be excited about this. You need to start scheduling your expectation interviews with Jacob. So if you haven't done that, you can mob Jesse and get your requests in as soon as possible for either virtual or in-person expectation interview. Yesterday, Jacob and Dave presented at the Select Committee on Pension Policy meeting. That meeting was recorded, and you can watch and listen to the presentation on TVW. Their portion of the presentation starts at about 18 minutes in. Finally, and most importantly, the board has traditionally canceled the August meeting. You all have done an excellent job in keeping us on schedule with the interim work plan. Kudos. If the board would like to enjoy a summer break, we would need a motion and a vote to cancel.
Right. Thank you.
Mr.
Pat.
Chair, move to cancel the August 19th meeting.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded to cancel the August 19th meeting. Discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right.
Next meeting is September 23rd.
It's September 23rd. Thanks, Karen. Did a great job.
You can show up.
All right, next on our list is our final under public comment. The LEOFF 2 board welcomes public comment in advance of all meetings and has posted instructions on the website for the submission of written comments. Staff received no comments in advance of today's meeting for distribution to the board. So if there's comments, we always say, put them out early so we can discuss them, right? Right. Thank you, Pat.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, sir.
move to adjourn.
Motion's been made and seconded to adjourn. Discussion.
Does this mean if we adjourn before we get our lunch, we don't get it? I'm just asking. AJ,
Important question.
it's very important. She's not saying anything. I guess we're okay.
I think there's some extra work around the office for you to completely change.
She's not biting. I can, yeah. All right, we have a motion made and seconded to adjourn. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, there we are. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you September 23rd. Good job, everybody.